Good afternoon, everyone. What I want to talk to you today about is intervention and prevention, which, if you're choosing the last essay question, is the lecture content most directly tied to that. If you're choosing that question, make sure you're not just summarizing the lecture, okay? You have to identify what's most directly relevant, right? The question's asking about neuropsychological methods, so you have to show that it's having an impact on the brain and behavior, right? So whatever question you're choosing, make sure you're answering the actual question directly, right? So intervention, we're talking here about strategies to reduce risk of reoffending once one has already committed a crime in a prison setting, reducing reoffending, or reducing delinquency, maybe for juvenile offenders. Prevention would be stopping crime in the first place, right? Identifying those risk factors we've looked at in the course early on, those biological risk factors, those social, environmental, whatever they might be, right? Other point before we begin, remember the announcement I put up, you can get extra credit from submitting the course evaluation. What I want to show you today is some evidence investigating what has now been shown to not work and what might work. We have a pretty good idea now on what doesn't work, okay? There were common treatments in the previous century that we have pretty good evidence now were failures. In terms of what does work, that's something that we're still working out, but there's treatments that certainly have promising findings. Yeah. In terms of what works best, that's still a question that needs to be fully answered. What doesn't work, first of all, scared straight programs. So these began in New Jersey. The first scared straight program was in the late 1970s with 17 juvenile delinquents in New Jersey. If you don't know, the Scared Straight program is when troubled teens are visited by someone who tells them scare stories. It could be a prison warden or a police officer. They tell them all the horrible things that are going to happen if you become a criminal, if you stay on this bad pathway. Here's what happens to this person. Here's what happens in prison. It's a horrible place. You want to stay away from it, hoping to scare them onto a better pathway, right? In the first program, 16 out of the 17 were trouble-free 3 months later. And everyone looked at that and thought, wow, that's excellent. Okay, let's put that in 30 more jurisdictions in the US, and then eventually 6 other countries. In part, the appeal was it was a very cheap program. It only cost about $1 per participant in the program. Okay, but actually, this is a small sample, 17, and 3 months is a pretty short follow-up. Okay. By this point, we have a lot more data over a larger period of time telling us how effective it actually is. And what we find is it's actually, if anything, having the opposite of the intended effect, because here we have a meta-analysis of 9 randomized controlled trials in which participants have either gone into the Scared Straight program or not. So it's not as if they're getting a better treatment, they're getting nothing. It's either this or not. And those who had this treatment were more likely to be offenders, increasing the odds of criminality by 1.7. Yeah. So actually, no promising findings at all. Actually, it was increasing the odds of problem behavior. Another common one is the drug abuse resistance education program. Began in LA, 1983. Most of you probably had this yourselves in your schools. Okay, it's in 80% of US schools. 26 million school children every year in the US have this workshop in their class. Someone, either a police officer or from a drug agency, comes into the class and again, tells you scare stories about how horrible drugs are and all the horrible things that will happen if you take these drugs. And they tell you particular case studies that are meant to scare you off taking drugs, right? If you look at the website for this program, you will find this quote: "It's proven so successful that it's now being implemented in 80% of the US school districts and in more than 54 countries around the world." If you look on the website for how and where it's been proven to be successful, you won't find anything because there is no evidence showing its effectiveness. Okay. If you dig deep, the only answer you get to that question is, well, it's so effective, it's in all these places. But actually, in terms of data showing that it reduces substance abuse, there's no data that exists to show us that. Okay. The meta-analyses we actually have show tiny, tiny effects that are non-significant. Okay. And that's for reducing delinquency or for reducing drug use. Another common treatment or intervention is this military boot camp that was quite popular at the end of the previous century. You've seen this in all the TV shows, right? Malcolm in the Middle, The Simpsons, and so on, right? It's this very harsh discipline, military-style camp in which they're training troubled teens to be more afraid of authority, to be more disciplined, to be more orderly, stick to a routine. The punishments are pretty physically harsh, grueling, many push-ups and so on. You have a drill sergeant in your face, right? Who's this authority figure? We have a meta-analysis of 44 studies telling us that there was zero effect in reducing delinquency or criminality. In a randomized trial, 5-year follow-up, zero effect. Yeah. What about physical punishment? So parents spanking their kids to teach them when they're misbehaving. Okay. What we have here is 2,000 children, and spanking increased problem behavior. It didn't decrease it. Similar, we have a meta-analysis of 88 studies showing us that delinquency was increased by physical punishment, 0.42, criminality was increased, 0.42. These are pretty moderate to strong effects, okay? Now, the evidence continues, there's plenty of it, okay? Over 12,000 children, those who were spanked at age 5 were more likely to have a conduct disorder when they were age 8, more likely to have antisocial behaviors, okay? Now, the obvious issue with this is that it's not possible to do a true experiment, okay? You can randomly allocate some children to being spanked by their parents and some children to not being. It's a quasi-experiment in which there's many potential confounds, okay? The children who were spanked might have different temperament traits. They might be more stimulation-seeking, hyperactive. These are the traits that we've seen to be relevant, okay, versus those who weren't spanked. But it certainly doesn't have a positive effect on decreasing crime or delinquency. And in terms of why that might be, it's not dealing with any underlying issue. It's not teaching the kid how to better get along with others, the importance of pro-social behavior, how to have empathy for others, okay? And it's also maybe teaching them, rather than how to deal with conflicts successfully or resolve conflicts in a more positive manner, it's okay to use aggression to deal with your issues. Another form of intervention that we know doesn't work is deep dive psychotherapy approaches. Those that are going deep into the individual's background, trying to help them reach some resolution about themselves, some major insights, a more Freudian approach to therapy. Okay. This is time-consuming and laborious, and there's no evidence that it has any positive effect in reducing criminality or delinquency. When intervention facilitators, forensic psychologists are running intervention programs, there's usually very, very strict guidelines over avoiding psychotherapy approaches like this, because it's not a good use of taxpayers' money. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's laborious, and there's no evidence that it actually has any promising effects. What's the common features of these programs that we know don't work? They really kind of further maybe aggravate youths who are already at risk. They're very limited in their duration, and they don't address any of the actual risk factors, the biological risk factors we've talked about in this course, but also the social, environmental ones, right? The attachment issues, the parenting issues at home, what the home environment is like, what relationships are like with peers, all these other things that we know are risk factors for violence. They really are limited to nothing but scare tactics and having some authority figure lecture the child on when they're doing something wrong, rather than, again, showing them a more positive way of dealing with things. So in terms of some interventions that might be more promising, I have behavioral parent training here, which is a combination of behavioral modification techniques using B.F. Skinner's work and social learning theory and Bandura's theory. So, in Bandura's work, the Bobo doll experiment is the most famous, right? The children who watched their parents act aggressively with the Bobo doll were more aggressive themselves. So the takeaway from that would be, if you give a child a good role model, right, then that's going to mean that they'll be more likely to mimic that and be pro-social themselves. So what this is about is teaching the parents how to be a better model, how to better teach their kids. Also about operant conditioning, effective punishments and rewards. We know from operant conditioning that rewards are better than punishments in changing long-term behavior. Punishments might have short-term effects, but not always long-term. And we also know from the token economy experiments and the replications of that, which types of rewards were most effective. Psychological rewards were more effective than financial or physical rewards. Those that boosted self-esteem or made one feel worthy or valued or emotionally close to someone else. I'm sure you've all seen programs like Super Nanny, right? That's basically what this is, right? Someone goes into the home and they train the parents how to be more effective in teaching their kids and using punishments and rewards. So you might use a point system for rewards, for example. You might have time out or planned ignoring of behavior for punishments. It's also reducing negative parenting methods, including those that the parents are not maybe aware of. Maybe they are enabling the child in some way. Maybe they're too permissive. Maybe they're too authoritarian. Help them reach a more middle ground. And increase parental monitoring. Now, we have a meta-analysis of 79 studies, and we see a small, moderate effect in reducing problem behavior, okay? It's more effective when the training is individual rather than with groups. So when the intervention facilitator is working one-on-one with the parents rather than a group of parents, okay? But overall, what we're talking about here is small to medium effects at best, okay? Another approach is multi-systematic therapy, which is a pretty popular one that's very, very comprehensive, but also quite expensive. Yeah. This is comprehensive because it deals with the home environment, how the child behaves at school, and how they behave with their peers. So it's targeting 12 to 17-year-olds who are at risk, who have already committed some act of delinquency and have been identified for a program like this. They're assigned a caseworker who's a clinician of at least master's level training, who's going to closely supervise them for the duration of the program. There is intensive cognitive behavioral therapy for the family, not just that child, okay, but with the immediate family. We're talking here about management for managing anger, social skills, healthy conflict resolution, impulse control. In terms of getting along better with peers, resolving conflicts, visual perspective taking, communication with teachers. If you're feeling angry and frustrated, what can you do about that? What's the best way of expressing that frustration to the teacher, okay, rather than acting out, for example? Dealing with issues at home, neglect, abuse, substance abuse. Okay. Comprehensive, right? But also time-consuming, laborious, expensive. And 14 follow-ups, okay? Those who did not have this intervention had an 81% reoffending rate, okay? For those who had it, a 50% recidivism rate. That's significantly less, okay, telling us that this program was better than nothing, but it's still 50% reoffending. It's not nothing, right? You have to reach a balance, and if it's cost effective, right? Yes, it is beneficial, but is it beneficial enough is a question, right? We have 11 randomized controlled trials, again, 42 to 54% reduction in recidivism across these studies, okay? So again, overall, certainly a benefit, okay, but is it beneficial enough? CBT seems to have strong effects. Okay, we have a meta-analysis of 56 studies over 8 countries, children and adolescents, and strong effects across the board in reducing delinquency and criminality. Certainly seems to be more effective in behavioral modification techniques. Okay, CBT more effective. What about then medication? So we're getting more biological now, dealing with imbalances in hormones or issues with neurotransmitters, okay, something more physical. 45 randomized placebo-controlled trials, okay, comparing those on medication versus those not. On average, a strong effect, moderate to strong, 0.56 in reducing aggressive behavior. Medication, okay, prescribed for reducing challenging behavior. It depends, of course, unsurprisingly, on what the medication is. So we have atypical antipsychotics treating the more negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Typical antipsychotics dealing with the positive symptoms. Stimulants for ADHD, mood stabilizers for mood disorders, antidepressants. So the average effect of these medications are different, right? They range from small to large, but overall, moderate to strong in terms of their effectiveness for reducing problem behavior. So caveats, of course, right? Medication is typically only successful so long as the person keeps taking the medication, right? In the case of this, in which problem behavior might be happening more frequently at a particular age, maybe that's not such an issue, but often an argument is that medication is masking symptoms rather than dealing with the underlying cause of the problem, right? 18% of children who are given antipsychotics are given it because of a disruptive behavioral disorder. What we see is pretty good evidence for change in behavior for this disorder in particular from this medication. Okay? So overall, pretty high effects from medication. That's with children. What about with adults? One type of medication that seems to be successful in reducing impulsivity, aggression in prisoners, aggressive behavior in the community is anticonvulsants, which are medications designed to decrease the odds of a seizure, okay, in those with maybe temporal lobe epilepsy, for example. Why might that be effective in reducing aggressive behavior? A medication designed for reducing likelihood of seizures. Well, the part of the brain it's targeting is parts of the limbic system, parts of the emotional network, the aggression network. Okay? And what it's doing is it's reducing activity in these parts of the brain. Okay? And so that is relevant, right, to the impulsivity criminal behavior we've been talking about. Nearly 26,000 adults with ADHD. We compare crime rates based upon when they were on medication versus when they were not. What we see is the medication reduces crime by 32% in men, 41% in women. Okay. Here we have over 4,000 children with ADHD matched to 20,000 controls. At age 22, we look at their crime rates. It's significantly higher for those with ADHD, 32% versus 16% of controls. For those who had medication with ADHD versus those with ADHD with no medication, a reduction in crime by 30 to 40%. Okay. In this particular study, serotonin reuptake inhibitors had no impact on reducing criminality, even though that's effective broadly because many impulsive offenders have a serotonin deficiency problem. Think about the participants that we're talking about. Their issue is tied more to ADHD, right? But again, overall promising effects, right, from medication. Another biological intervention is physical castration. Okay. In continental Europe, there's many countries in which sexual offenders can opt in for physical castration, having their testes removed. Why would anyone do this? Well, if you're a sexual offender facing decades in prison, that's not going to be a pleasant experience. Okay, sexual offenders are more subject to beatings, tortures, rape than other inmates are. And if you're opting in for physical castration, that might be an alternative to prison. Okay, it might be a better alternative. Germany is one country in which sex offenders can opt in for this treatment. And this is a study from Germany. It's as close as a comparison as we can get. Okay, 99 castrated sexual offenders, 35 non-castrated sexual offenders. All of them opted in for the program and passed all of the checks and assessments. There are psychological assessments that have to take place before one can be physically castrated. You have to be of sane mind. You have to be legally competent, okay, to opt in for this. They all passed all of the checks, but then 35 at the last minute decided against it, okay? So we're comparing them to the 99 that went ahead with it, okay? It's as close as a comparison as we can get, because in normal comparisons, the obvious problem is that those who opt in for these programs are more motivated to change than those who don't opt in, right? This is as close as we can get to controlling for that content. This represents 25% of those in Germany that year within the physical castration program. So it's a pretty good insight into that population. We follow them up 11 years later. The controls have a recidivism rate of 74%. Okay. 46% committed some other sexual offense within those 11 years. 43% some non-sexual offense within those 11 years. Okay. For the castrated group, only 25% had reoffended, a substantial decline. Okay. 3% had committed a sexual offense in those 11 years. That's actually one man who sexually assaulted and killed a young girl, and then that young girl's mother shot and killed that offender. 25% have committed some non-sexual offense in those 11 years. Okay, again, a substantial reduction. In 10 non-controlled studies in Switzerland, Germany, and Denmark, non-controlled, so we're not comparing it to anything, we're just looking at the recidivism rate for those that were physically castrated. Okay, recidivism rates across these countries for those that were physically castrated range from 0 to 11%. The normal recidivism rate for sexual offending is about 20%. Okay, so that's a very good reduction than the norm. Okay. Over 2,000 other physically castrated Europeans, recidivism rates ranged from 0 to 7%. Okay? Again, dramatically lower than that average of 20. Okay? Now, this is a controversial form of intervention. Many people argue that we're violating some human rights, that it's not really much of a choice at all if the choice is physical castration or beatings for decades in prison. Okay? But the counterpoint would be to that, well, who is objecting to it is not the one that has to endure the consequences. Right? The offenders are the one who are going to have to deal with the consequences of their choice, and so maybe they should be the ones to make the choice. I can tell you that these 99 offenders were followed up on years later to ask if they regretted their decision or not. 75% said they made the right decision, 25% regretted it. Okay, so that's the majority of these felt as though they made the right choice. Physical castration is not an option here in the US, but chemical castration is, which would be a sex drive reduction drug as opposed to testes removal. Again, we find pretty good effects from chemical castration. For a long time, the side effects of chemical castration were so severe that most people who had it couldn't really live any normal life. Some people still have pretty bad side effects, but it seems to be getting much better, and that the side effects are more endurable. There are 2 states in the country that mandate chemical castration for those who have committed a series of sexual offenses against a child. Okay? So in the state of California and in the state of Florida, if you've committed at least 2 sexual assaults on children, then chemical castration will always, in all cases, be a condition of release. Okay, whether it's for parole or total release out of prison. Okay. Louisiana, Wisconsin, and Alabama also mandate chemical castration under some circumstances, but it depends more upon the case. It's more of a case-by-case basis rather than a universal rule. There are other states that have it as an option for sex offenders to opt in for. Montana, Oregon, Georgia. Okay. Again, it could be an option as an alternative to prison. Okay. But again, overall, pretty dramatic reductions in recidivism rates, okay, from both forms of castration. What about more prevention strategies? Dealing with the risk factors early on. So improving nutrition, for example, that's something that we talked about, right? Unhealthy diets, especially during brain development, lead to unhealthy brains. Unhealthy brains lead to unhealthy behaviors, right? Simple as that. This is a study I told you about from Mauritius. I gave it as an example of moderation, right? When talking about mediation, moderation. I'll tell you a bit more about it. So it's in Mauritius. We have children at nursery. Controls are those who are just continuing with their normal nursery. And then we have 100 in the experimental condition that are given an enriched program. They're given a good, healthy lunch every day. They're given a set number of hours for exercise every day. They're given extra classes that involve drama, arts and crafts, learning to play an instrument. So it's more than their typical curriculum. We're following up to measure their conduct disorders at age 17, and then their self-reported criminal behavior at age 23. Okay. The control group is in yellow, the enrichment program, the experimental group is in red. Significant difference in conduct disorders and in aggression at age 17, right? Significant reduction in criminal behavior at age 23, okay? Overall, significant effects that are small to moderate in terms of their effects. But what I showed you is that there was a moderator to this. It depended upon their background, right? if they come from homes in which there was good nutrition, they had good breakfasts, healthy dinners, they were well fed at home, or did they come from a home in which they were not well fed? Okay. For those who came from a good home, the effect was much smaller, okay, 0.15. For those that came from a bad home, much higher, 0.63, 53% reduction, right? Unsurprising, okay? The more at risk you are, the more, on average, this is going to change in that group, right? Going a little bit fast. Is there any questions so far? Keeping up okay?
Well, like you're talking about how like sexual offenders could like opt in to getting like doing chemical castration versus spending more time in prison. Why would anyone not do that?
I mean,
It seems like a clear like why would it's like yeah you could be insane and just stay in prison, or you could actually become better and not be in prison.
I mean, it's for a child with sexual offender, you would think that's an obvious choice to choose. Only some states have it as an option, though, right? Most states don't have it as an option. It's only those that I discussed. And for a long time, the possible side effects were a main reason not to do it. Because sometimes also part of the parole or conditions of your release would not just be the chemical castration. It might also be, for example, holding down a job successfully. And if the side effects of this medication are so bad that, for example, you're throwing up constantly all day and you can't really keep a job, then it makes keeping to the other conditions of parole quite difficult.
Just for this last study on nutrition, was part of the enrichment program like improved nutrition?
Yeah.
In nursery? Okay, so the moderator was that like it was less of an effect for children who also already had good nutrition.
Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
thank you.
Ellie, you want this closed?
Yes.
Ellie, do you have a question as well?
No, you answered it.
Another prevention strategy or intervention, depending upon when we implement it, is omega-3. Okay. Something also that we talked about that's part of healthy brain development includes chemicals necessary for the development of the corpus callosum, the brain membrane. Okay. One way of giving this to children is as a supplement in a fruit juice, for example. So here we have an omega-3 group, an experimental group. You have this fruit juice every day containing the omega-3 supplement, and then the control group who have a placebo. It's the same carton, looks like the same thing, but actually there's no omega-3 supplement, it's just a fruit juice. Okay. We're measuring their callous, unemotional traits, these signs of psychopathy, right? They're taking this juice for 6 months. At 6 months, we see a significant decline in the omega-3 group, and then it continues to decline 6 months later, even after 6 months of not taking the drink. Omega-3 is going to be most beneficial if you take it every day or frequently enough. And the half-life of omega-3 is 2 years. Okay, so even if you are not taking it all the time, the effects can still be long-lasting. The brown group, the control placebo group, they report a decline in psychopathic traits at first, likely a placebo effect because it then increases in the next follow-up. Okay. So that's with children, promising signs in reducing signs of psychopathy just by introducing this one factor, omega-3. And what about in changing the behavior of offenders? Okay. Here, this time, we have a clinical trial with a control group who have nothing, a placebo group who also have a fruit juice with no omega-3 supplement. It's the exact same fruit juice, it's the exact same cardan. And then the omega-3 group who have the fruit juice that does contain the omega-3 supplement. This time, two measurements. We have the prisoners self-report their antisocial behavior, and then the officers who are looking after them in prison make their observations, also reporting the antisocial behaviors of the same inmates, right? To validate one by comparing it to the other. So controls, first of all, this gray line, a spike here in self-reported antisociality, but by the end of the observation, it's the same as it was at the start of the study. Pretty similar, according to the observations by the officers, no real change. Okay, even though this is 3 months into taking, 3 months into the study, 6 months into the study, and then a 6-month additional follow-up. They're only taking the fruit juice, those in the placebo group and the experimental group, for the 6 months. Okay. The omega-3 group, this green line, right, immediately within 3 months, a reduction in self-reported antisocial behavior, and it stays at that level. 3 months later, after continuing to take the fruit juice with the omega-3, and then an additional 6 months later of not taking the omega-3, still this promising finding of a reduction. And the observations of the officers support this, that there was a steady decline for an entire year in those who took this intervention. Okay. The blue group is the placebo group who think they're having the omega-3 but are not. A tiny dip in self-reported antisocial behavior, likely a small placebo effect because it increases after that. According to the officers, their antisocial behavior only increases. You can think maybe, the officers have been told this person is taking an intervention to reduce their antisocial behavior. They're not seeing any change, so maybe they are kind of overinflating the antisocial behavior in their observations. The question.
I was just asking if the officers knew which group they were in.
No, it's double blind. Yeah, so they don't know either. Another study, this time with children again. The dependent variable is different. This time we're measuring externalizing behavior. Okay, we have 4 groups this time. A group who have cognitive behavioral therapy to reduce their externalizing behavior. A group who are taking omega-3, and then a group who have both interventions. Okay, the omega-3 and the CBT, and then a group of controls who have nothing. This time, less promising findings. Well, we do see initial declines in externalizing behavior based upon the interventions. By the end of the study, there's no real difference. Okay, but the dependent variable is different. Okay, there might be a ceiling effect because more children display externalizing behavior, signs of a conduct disorder, and it's less stable than psychopathy, right? In this study, we're measuring early signs of psychopathy, callousness, unemotionality, right? It's a greater risk for criminality. It's a more stable characteristic. So it might depend upon what we're measuring in terms of whether it has an effect. Okay, but either way, omega-3 is not going to be some silver bullet, right, that eradicates crime. It could, though, be one beneficial piece, okay, along with other interventions, right? Any questions? Another approach is early prenatal intervention. Before the baby is born, we deal with families that are at higher risk. So, for example, single parent mothers who are basically in poverty, who don't come from good backgrounds themselves, and then we educate them on how to improve their lives, how to be better parents, the importance of keeping healthy when you're pregnant and looking after your child. Okay, so here we have a randomized controlled trial, 400 unmarried low socio-economic status pregnant women, comparing those who are given this training program to those who are not. Those within the intervention are visited 9 times before giving birth and 23 times during the first 2 years of the child being born. Okay. They're told about how to look after themselves when they're pregnant, the importance of good nutrition, okay, avoiding smoking, including secondhand smoke exposure, the effects of alcohol, all of the factors I've told you about, right, the impact early health, the impact brain development. They're taught about how to better care for children. They're taught about many of the things you have been taught about in your psychology classes. Okay, the parenting styles, the attachment styles, the benefits that come along with the most advantageous styles, right? The benefits from the research on how to be an effective parent. And they're given personal development as well. They're given help with any education that they want, and qualifications that they might want to help them get ahead in their job. And workshops that can help them in their careers. Is there a particular skill that you think could help you get a promotion, for example, or advance in your career? Okay. So we're not just helping them be better parents, we're helping them be more successful, satisfied in their lives in general. Okay. We then follow up 15 years later. Okay. The children to these parents, the children to these single mothers, have a 53% reduction in arrests, 63% reduction in conviction rates, 56% reduction rate in how many of the 15-year-olds are drinking alcohol, and 40% reduction in how many of the 15-year-olds are smoking cigarettes. Okay, substantial, dramatic improvements. Okay, it's obvious that improving education would significantly decrease crime. Okay, the issue is that it's expensive to give this sort of targeted intervention, and the effects will not be found for 15 years, 15 to 20 years. Right? But what we know from research is that in the long term, it's cost effective. Okay, the taxpayer saves money in the long term. Okay, because conviction rates are reduced so much, crime is reduced so much that the cost needed for investigations, legal proceedings, all of that declines substantially. Okay, so in the long term, it's cost effective. The issue, of course, is that many people don't want to think about benefits 15, 20 years later, right? You might not even be the one to benefit. It might be other members of society, right? And certainly, politically, it's not a good move to put resources into something that's not going to have benefits for 20 years, right? You want short-term benefits to help you get re-elected, for example, right? Rather than someone else maybe getting the credit for the work that you put in. But it's obvious, it's undoubtable that improving education, improving nutrition, putting money into that in the long term would have many benefits. Another intervention is mindfulness training, in which we focus awareness on internal states, our emotions, our bodily states. We're more in tune with our emotions and more conscious when it comes to taking control of our behavior in emotional states, rather than letting your emotions rule you, right? You're thinking about how you're going to behave when you're stressed out, when you're upset, angry, and so on. You're also taught to take a more compassionate, empathetic approach to people, non-judgmental stance, try to put yourself in their shoes, rather than get angry with people. The benefits of mindfulness training are well established, okay, in terms of its impact on behavior. A decrease in anger, increase in emotional regulation, reduction in impulsivity in teens, reduction in childhood antisociality and aggression, reduced hostility in prisoners, improved sleep quality for prisoners, and yes, according to one review, a reduction in recidivism also from mindfulness training. We also know that mindfulness training has a physical effect on the brain. These findings are also well established. It improves frontal functioning. It changes amygdala functioning depending upon the individual. It increases the thickness of the temporal prefrontal junction, okay, part of the brain where the angular gyrus is, okay, part of the brain that we talked about in Adrian Rain's first study that's been found to be relevant to advanced ability in mathematics. So, increases prefrontal cortical thickness, enhances prefrontal functioning, insular functioning, hippocampal functioning, all parts of the brain we've talked about, right? The insula, the center point for empathy in the documentary we watched, right? When you see faces of people afraid, that's the part of the brain that most lights up because you have a sense of empathy for that person in distress, right? The hippocampus, the part of the brain involved in the consolidation of memory and learning new skills, right? We've looked at the importance of all these parts of the brain. Improves the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, okay? And in children, improved connection, okay, between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala when viewing fearful faces. So well-documented findings that mindfulness training has a positive effect on behavior and on the brain, okay? What we also know is that prison has a negative effect on one's cognitive abilities, their emotion regulation. It's an unhealthy environment to be in, right? It's not very good cognitive stimulation. It's a high stress situation in which you're always on edge. There's always fights and so on. There's detriments there to one's social abilities, their emotion regulation or cognitive abilities, which is not ideal when we're hoping to rehabilitate people and lower their risk, right? If you go into jail for 10 years, the hope is you go out of jail less likely to commit a crime, not more likely to commit a crime, right? But if there is these experiences that are disadvantageous to the brain and behavior, it can have the reverse effect. So what might we be able to do to mitigate this? What might be done to lessen the negative impacts that prison has? Okay. One possibility could be CBT and mindfulness training. Okay. We're measuring cognitive control and emotion regulation based upon the no-go-go task that you've tried yourselves in the neurocognition lecture that we did, right? You're told, press this key for a smiley face, don't press it for a sad face, but if you press it, that's a misfire, right? It indicates greater impulsivity and less cognitive control, okay? So we're measuring misfires on the y-axis here at the beginning of one sentence, okay? And then 4 months in. We have two groups, a control group who have no intervention, and then an experimental group who have CBT and mindfulness training as the intervention, right? In the blue group, there's a substantial increase in misfires, okay? Cognitive control has gone down, emotion regulation has gone down, they're more impulsive, they're performing worse. The same is also true for the experimental group, but it's a much, much smaller effect, right? Tiny effect in comparison to the experimental group, telling us that the negative effects of prison might indeed be mitigated by this intervention. Okay. Here we have a randomized controlled trial of mindfulness training. Some inmates in the experimental mindfulness training group, controls are not. Those in the mindfulness training group have mindfulness training for 8 weeks, 2 hours a week. Okay. We see positive effects. The experimental group has a reduction in aggression. They have better sleep quality. Their cortisol levels are lower, showing us physical evidence that stress is lower. And their psychological instruments also telling us that their self-reported stress is lower. Okay. Unfortunately, 3 months after the study finished, there was no long-term effects, mainly because no one really opted to continue the mindfulness training. They were all given the choice. The study is finished, but you can continue with the mindfulness training if you want. Only 2 of them opted to continue with it. Okay, so mindfulness training might be something that is only really at its most beneficial if one continues the mindfulness training, rather than having long-lasting effects. Many prisoners are skeptical over its benefits. It's very removed, right, from the crime that happened. If you're doing CBT, for example, you're being challenged on your distortions when talking about the victim, when talking about the case, when talking about your backgrounds, when talking about your views. It's clear to see how it all relates to why you're here in prison, right? In terms of mindfulness training, it has nothing really to do with the crime that you committed, right? So it's harder maybe for them to see, what's this got anything to do with why I'm here, right? Medication too, it's obvious how that might be beneficial. It's having a physical change, right? But many view mindfulness training as too abstract, wishy-washy, not really something genuine, okay? And not just in prison, there's skeptics in the general population as well. And indeed, mindfulness training varies in its success quite a lot. Some people find it very effective, some people much less effective. In part, probably impacted by how optimistic you are over its effectiveness, right? It's a kind of self-efficacy component to it. Questions? One last treatment to tell you about. It's transcranial direct current stimulation, which is a form of intervention being tested by Olivia Choi, who's a former PhD student of Adrian Raine. What it is a device that gives a mild shock to the prefrontal cortex, exciting the neurons, increasing activity in the prefrontal cortex. Okay. I say a mild shock, I don't have first-hand experience of it, but from what I read, the experiences differ from not feeling anything to feeling an itchy sensation. There's no reports of anything dramatic. So we have an experimental group who are given this stimulation, and then controls who are given a placebo. Basically, the device has 2 settings. It has a genuine setting in which the person actually gets a shock. And then there's a sham setting in which it lights up and everything as though it's giving a shock, but actually it's not, nothing's happening. So it's a placebo, if anything. And then the participants are given a series of scenarios to measure how likely they would be to commit physical assault or sexual assault in these scenarios. The scenarios are detailed. They're intended to grab the participant, have them use their imagination, picture themselves in the scenario, and think about what they would do. So one of these scenarios, for example, is you're out at a bar with your girlfriend. It's all males and the participant. It's all male participants, by the way. Let's assume they're all heterosexual males. They're on a date with their girl at a bar. And they go to the restroom, they come back, there's some guy chatting up your girlfriend. Okay, even worse, she seems to be having a good time, okay? She's laughing at his jokes and so on. So you go over there, you tell the guy, back off. That's my girlfriend you're talking to. He says, well, there's no ring on her finger. She can talk to whoever she wants. Okay, and then it kind of gets more intense. He kind of gets in your face. He tells you, you're the one who should take a hike. And then you're asked eventually, how likely would you be to punch this guy? Okay. So what we're measuring is how likely you would be to commit a physical assault in various different cases, a sexual assault in various scenarios. Some participants have this stimulation to the prefrontal cortex during all of this, right? That's the experimental group. The control group does not. Okay. The control group committed the physical assault on average about 23% of the time. The group with stimulation to the prefrontal cortex, about 12–13% of the time, but a 48% reduction in physical assaults. For sexual assault, it's about 9 versus 3%, okay? About a 70% reduction in sexual assaults. Obviously, this is hypothetical. Okay, it's not actually measuring how you would respond in this situation. We're not seeing a change in behavior. We're seeing a change in self-reports for a hypothetical scenario. A question, Madeline?
Yeah, I think I'm sorry if you said this, but is this something that they're reading, or is this like an interview that someone's describing a situation to them, like emotionally, like
No, they're reading it.
themselves?
Yeah, I believe on a screen in front of them. Yeah. So that's hypothetical scenarios. What about actually looking for a change in behavior? Okay, so that was another study by Olivia Choi only last year. This time we have male and female participants. Again, we have an experimental group who have this prefrontal cortex stimulation and a control group who do not. This time we're comparing their responses in the point subtraction aggression paradigm, which is a measurement of reactive aggression I told you about earlier in the course. You're doing a series of games to win points, okay? The goal is to get to the maximum number of points as quickly as possible to complete the game. But there's another participant who on the messaging app is hurling insults at you, okay? Telling you how awful you are at this game. God, you suck every time you mess up, okay? Trying to get under your skin. You're thinking, what's up with this? You know, I'm just a college student trying to get extra credit for my course. Why is this person bullying me, okay? But it's a computer, right, that's designed to provoke you. And then you have the option of either adding points to yourself when you win the game or taking points away from the other person to stop them, you know, getting to the end. It has no real benefit for you, okay? But that's an example of retaliation, right? That you were provoked. So we're calling it reactive aggression. The men in the control group retaliated on average 70% of the time. The men who have the prefrontal cortex stimulation retaliated less than 50% of the time. Okay, a significant decline. There's no significant difference in the women, but they were less likely to retaliate anyway. So again, this is measuring a change in behavior this time, yes, but it's on this point game scenario. It's not like actual physical aggression, right? That, you know, we're limited as researchers. We can't provoke students into punching each other, okay? So this is kind of the best as we can get, okay, to something real in terms of aggressive behavior. The other main limitation of this is we're seeing an effect when the intervention is occurring at the time in which the offense would occur, right? But in real life, you know, how is that going to work? Someone's going to punch someone, someone runs out and gives them this device and pops on their head, right, and gives stimulation to the prefrontal cortex. That's not going to work, right? But what could be a possibility is having this as an intervention routinely, like one would for therapy, in the hopes that there might be a long-lasting change. So in the book that was, you know, the recommended text for the course, Adrian Rain talks about some parents who came to him because they had heard about his research and they were desperate for some help with their child. Their child was a problem child who was always getting into fights, who was highly aggressive, who was callous, unemotional, and they had tried everything. They had gone to every therapist, they had tried every therapy, they had tried every medication, and nothing seemed to work. Nothing seemed to change his behavior. He was an adopted child, and the other siblings who were non-adopted had no issues, okay? So likely it was something genetic, biological, nothing in the environment that would explain this. Because they had exhausted all of these other types of treatment that had all been unsuccessful, Adrian Rain suggested this transcranial direct stimulation every week, okay? After 6 months, the parents said that this was the only thing that had caused a change in behavior. After 6 months, they witnessed a massive decline in his aggressive behavior, improvements in empathy, and so on. Now, that's one case. We have to be careful over making generalizations, but hopefully that's something that could be tested in a larger scale, right? And maybe there would then be, you know, long-lasting effects if it was used in this sort of way. Yeah.
Can this be used on like other brain structures, or is it too hard to get like, for example, on like the amygdala or
Yeah,
something
it's a
like
good
that?
point. I know there's been talk about, could you do something similar for the amygdala? The amygdala is such a deep structure within the brain, it's so hard to reach through something like this. It would need something far more invasive. So there's nothing yet that would stimulate the amygdala. But that would be a good source to investigate if it was possible.
Difficult would it, like, how accessible is this? How easy would it be to make it more accessible if people wanted to use it as like a prevention strategy?
To get the transcranial direct stimulating, the device is not too expensive. The department here has several. Good ones are like $1,000. You can get cheaper ones for hundreds of dollars. So it's something that could be pretty accessible, I would say.
Can you get it just like, could I just go and buy it?
Yeah, there's places you can buy it, yeah. So the kind of summary on what we've talked about, on some things that don't work and some things that might work, it's pretty good evidence for some of these. Some of these are a bit more experimental, early days, but there's promising signs for some. Any questions on anything we've covered?